He is a regular contributor to 5280 magazine and has freelanced articles for many publications around the country. Schrager has a bachelor's degree in history from the University of Michigan and a master's degree in broadcast journalism from Northwestern University. He began his career in 1991 with CBS News in London, then moved back to the States. After working in various capacities for TV stations in La Crosse, Michigan, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin, he moved to Denver in 1999, and he lives in Denver, in the Metro Denver, with his wife, Kathy, and their daughter, Harper. Please welcome our speaker for today, Adam Schrager.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for inviting me to share with you the story of a principled politician. And I guarantee you it is not an oxymoron. I'm honored to be sharing with you this story today that is set in Colorado, but really has no borders. Make no mistake that while this story is set in the 1940s, it has relevance in today's day and age. It's a story about the best of humanity during the worst of times. It's a story about former Colorado Governor Ralph Carr, who in 1942 said unapologetically, "If I don't speak the feeling of the people of Colorado in my office as governor, then I haven't any right to be there." At the time, he was standing up for the constitutional rights of Japanese Americans right after Pearl Harbor, and that stand against ignorance and bigotry would cost him his career. You all will be very thankful to know I am embracing the former governor's preeminent rule to speech-making, which is never outspeak the bladder capacity of your audience. There are big jars of iced tea and water, but I am going to be cognizant as to how long I go, because this is a thought-provoking subject which certainly might lead to some questions afterwards. I have long said that the best part about my job as a reporter is that I meet extraordinary people who describe themselves as ordinary, and in my opinion, it makes them even more extraordinary. Maybe it's the woman with 3 prosthetic limbs who comes down to the state capitol to lobby lawmakers to ensure other amputees have appropriate insurance coverage. Maybe it's the husband and wife who foster 250 children, adopt 10 of them, and when asked why, simply said, "Somebody has to." Or maybe it's the 30-something couple that sets aside lucrative IT careers to open up a cafe over on Colfax Avenue, where you only pay if you can afford it. They are extraordinary people who describe themselves as ordinary. In September 1950, Colorado in this country lost one of those extraordinary people, a man who I've come to know over the course of 6 years, immersing myself in his professional and personal records and trying to read every word ever written about him and every word ever written by him. And I stand here today believing that Ralph Carr is more extraordinary than I believed on the day that I first heard of him. On that day in January of 2002, I was doing a story on a proposed measure to make Governor Carr's birthday a voluntary state holiday in Colorado. I met a state capitol tour guide by the name of Carol Keller. She was at the Ralph Carr plaque, which is on the wall on the first floor of the Capitol just outside the governor's office. And she had a small group in tow. She spoke about a man of conviction, of dedication, and of principle. The week that he died in 1950, Colorado's poet laureate Thomas Hornsby Farrell wrote the following: "Ralph Carr was a one-man crusade for freedom all of his life. I've heard it said," he wrote, "that Ralph Carr could have gone down as a great American, known to everybody in every state, if he'd simply been willing to wangle more of the breaks his way and be less bullheaded about the constitutional rights of the underdogs." Well, Thomas Hornsby Farrell believed they can have their definition of what a great American is. But it seems to me, he wrote, that if we had more men like Ralph Carr along the line, we wouldn't need to keep puffing up so many other great men to bail us out. Over the course of this talk, we'll look at why Ralph Carr has been forgotten, and maybe more importantly, in my opinion, why he needs to be remembered. Now, it was known throughout the state capitol in 1939 that the governor had a temper. I stand here today telling you the story of a political hero, but by no means a perfect individual. It was the kind of temper that made even his best of friends cringe. No politician was too big, no businessman too powerful to escape his wrath. His friends like to tell the story of a time after a football game at the University of Denver, back when they actually played football there, and the line of cars to leave the parking lot after the game had ended seemed to go on forever. Well, Governor Carr was an impatient man by nature. A wasted minute was a wasted opportunity. And so when it finally came time for his car to move and another driver cut in front of him, "You son of a bitch," Governor Carr yells out of his car window. Well, the other driver, as it's related through the years, is a large, hulking man who does not hesitate to put his car in park and jump out and confront the man who had just cursed him. Well, Governor Carr, all 5'8" and a half of him, doesn't hesitate either. He jumps out of his car, runs right up to the man and points at him and says, "I called you by your right name, didn't I?" Maybe it was the fact the gentleman recognized Governor Carr or the state patrol officer that was standing behind him at the time. But he demurred, got back into his car, and Governor Carr, of course, smiled, and they both went on their respective ways. On February 19th, 1942, Ralph Carr's staff was witnessing one of those eruptions, and it was not over anything trivial at all. It was directed squarely at President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The governor was pacing, clenching in his fist a telegram that announced Executive Order 9066, which starts out, "Whereas the successful prosecution of the war requires every possible protection against espionage and against sabotage to national defense material, national defense premises, and national defense utilities." Governor Carr paused to take a deep breath before he read aloud what he believed to be the most onerous sentence of all. "I hereby authorize," the president wrote, "and direct the Secretary of War and the military commanders, whom he may from time to time designate, to prescribe military areas in such places from which any or all persons may be excluded." Now, Ralph Carr knew when you got past the formality of the language, this was a de facto declaration of martial law on the West Coast, with one not very well hidden agenda, and that was to forcibly remove anyone of Japanese descent. His eyes flashed, and the anger in Ralph Carr's voice was apparent. "Now that's wrong," he shouted. "Some of these Japanese are citizens of the United States." And in case his staffers had missed that point, "They're American citizens," he shouted again. In our recent past, we look at the events of 9/11 really as a seminal moment in our history, and the shock and the fear and the anger that we all experienced is still palpable in many of us today. Yet I believe it paled in comparison to what happened in this country after Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. The thousands of postcards, notes, and telegrams sitting in Governor Carr's collection at the Colorado State Archive did not need to have been written in all capital letters or each sentence end in exclamation points in order to literally scream off of the page at you. They came from homemakers and businessmen from the eastern part of this state and the western part of this state, from big cities and small towns. I have been told that reading these sentiments is the most difficult part of the book that I've written, The Principled Politician, especially for people of Japanese descent. Some people have said to me, in fact, "I get it already. You've included too many examples." Americans were scared of anyone of Japanese descent, and they were angry at Governor Carr for his stand on behalf of them. You have overproved your point. And consistently I have told them, apparently I haven't. You see, Ralph Carr could not turn away. He didn't have the modern luxury of a mute button. He couldn't go somewhere to get away from the tension. He could not say enough already. Let's move on. Because in the early part of 1942, every newspaper showed blaring headlines of how the United States was losing the war in the Pacific. Every radio station was broadcasting the names of the local boys killed in action or taken prisoner by the Japanese.